Elden Ring has many bosses. However, out of all of them, there are certain bosses who are called Remembrance bosses. These bosses award the player a remembrance upon being defeated, which can be used to acquire their gear, most notably their weapon. So today, we will be looking at the top 5 best Remembrance weapons in Elden Ring's base game. To rank these weapons against each other, I have followed some rules which are as follows. First, only weapons obtained from a boss's remembrance will be counted for this list, so do not expect to see Gargoyle's Black Blade or Godskin Peeler on this list. Second, as the title of the video suggests, only base game remembrance weapons will be counted on this list, so do not expect to see Spear of the Impaler, Sword Lance, or Alana's Twin Blades. Third, only physical weapons will be counted for this list, so you won't see Fortisax's Lightning Spear or Presidisax's Ruin appear here. Fourth, testing of these weapons were done on a character with soft caps of 50 on every offensive stat in NG plus 7, however, no buffs in the form of talismans or spell buffs were used. Fifth, this video will be primarily focusing on PvE and not PvP. And finally, this ranking is ultimately based on my opinion and a ranking criteria that I have developed for myself, which can very well differ from your own. But without further ado, let's look at the best remembrance weapons in base game of Elden Ring. Coming at the number 5 spot are Star Scourge Greatswords. And yes, Greatswords, since you essentially get 2 of these when you trade Radahn's Remembrance for this weapon. Star Scourge Greatswords are 2 ultra colossal swords which cannot be two-handed. Instead, players equip a second sword in their hand when they try to do so. This means that the players can only do one-handed or power stance moves of colossal swords when using this weapon. This also means that in order to use this weapon, players need to have the exact 38 strength requirement as shown on the item card to use this weapon effectively. Having a B scaling in strength and doing split physical and magic damage, this weapon strikes pretty hard when used on a dedicated strength build. However, that's not all, as these swords come equipped with a unique Ash of War that mimics one of Radahn's own attacks. This attack is called Star Caller Cry. This attack involves the player roaring a gravity well into existence, which pulls all enemies within its radius towards the player. After the roar, the player slams the 2 swords onto the ground, creating a dome of magic blast that does very good damage and even sends humanoid enemies flying. When you spam your jumping attacks with this weapon, you can achieve some very nice damage. So why are these swords on the number 5 spot, you may ask? Well, the reason is that they are power stanced colossal swords. This means that they are extremely heavy, slow, and consume way too much stamina for all their benefits. It also does not help when it comes to stance damage, as these weapons do quite low in this regard when compared to two-handed attacks of a single colossal sword. The Starcaller Cry Ash of War is also quite overrated among the community as well. While the damage from this Ash of War is good, the stance damage and animation length is horrendous. As a result of all these downsides, I cannot put Star Scourge Greatswords any higher on this list, thus they get the number 5 spot. At the number 4 spot, we have the Morgoth's Cursed Sword. Possibly one of, if not the most underrated weapon in Elden Ring, Morgoth's Cursed Sword is among the best curved greatswords of this game. Acquired from the remembrance of the Omen King, Morgoth's Cursed Sword is the longest and, strangely enough, the lightest weapon in its class at just 7.5 weight. Not that curved greatswords are super heavy, however this weapon is noticeably lighter than commonly used weapons of its class such as the Dismounter or Bloodhound's Fang, who have a weight of 11. Aside from this, Morgoth's Cursed Sword is also the only default arcane scaling curved greatsword of Elden Ring, which has innate bleed buildup. However, to get bleed from this weapon, players need to make use of its Ash of War called Cursed Blood Slice. This attack mimics one of Morgoth's attacks, where he creates a cut with his blade similar to the Blood Flame Talon's incantation. If the player presses their L1 button again after doing the first cut, they will make a follow-up cut similar to how Morgoth can do so in his boss fight. This cut and its blast do primarily fire but also massive amounts of bleed on anyone who gets hit by them. Players can also hit an enemy with the blade of this weapon during the Ash of War to get even more bleed buildup as well as regular damage. While all this may sound amazing, there are some downsides that have prevented Morgoth's Cursed Sword from reaching a higher spot. First, this weapon has an awkward stat requirement, which in my opinion does not match its playstyle. While the regular attacks on this sword can do good damage, its best damaging attack is its Ash of War. However, this weapon's best scaling is from Dexterity, which does not boost the damage of that Ash of War. Instead, that stat is Arcane, but Morgoth's Cursed Sword only has a D scaling in Arcane. As if that is not awkward enough, this weapon also has a surprisingly high 35 dex requirement to be wielded effectively. While meeting this weapon's stat requirement is not super difficult by the time you get it, the build you end up with, in my opinion, is not properly optimized for this weapon. As a result, Morgoth's Cursed Sword gets the number 4 spot on my list. Sharing the middle rank, we have the Axe of Godric and Winged Greathorn. It may sound weird to have two very different weapons take the same spot, however, based on your preferred combat style, you may want to pick one of these over the other. Let me explain. When fully upgraded, Axe of Godric gets its strength and dex scaling boosted to C, while Winged Greathorn boosts them to B. Axe of Godric also has a very unique heavy attack among great axes, however it does around the same stance and regular damage. The reason why I have put both of these axes on this list is because of their Ash of Wars, which for Axe of Godric is called I Command Thee. Yeah, they gave an Ash of War that name. This Ash of War mimics Godric's ground slam attack, where players slam this axe on the ground to do massive damage around a decent area of effect. However, upon pressing the L1 button again, players will do a third slam like Godric's second phase, which has an even bigger area of effect. This allows players to achieve roughly 50% more damage than a fully charged attack, which is not very good since the stance damage of this skill is very low and the animation is very long. To get that 50% more damage, you need to hit a target with all 3 slams. Getting all 3 slams to hit a non-staggered target is very difficult and not really worth it for the lower stance damage than a two-handed fully charged attack. On the other hand, the Winged Greathorn has an Ash of War called Soul Stifler. This makes the player create some aura around themselves, which when comes in contact of an enemy, debuffs them to take 15% more damage from all damage types for a duration of 1 minute. And it's this skill that allows Winged Greathorn to compete with the Axe of Godric on this list. Normally, Axe of Godric does more damage than Winged Greathorn, however Winged Greathorn surpasses Axe of Godric when Soul Stifler's debuff is applied. This debuff is pretty easy to apply on most enemies and bosses and has a moderate FP cost of just 12. As a result of this, I have put both of these weapons on this spot, since if you are a player who is comfortable applying this debuff on an enemy during the fight, Winged Greathorn is superior. Otherwise, Axe of Godric will be the better choice. Regardless of which one you consider is the superior Great Axe, their early acquisition and easy to meet stat requirements make them a solid boss weapon choice in Elden Ring. At the penultimate spot, we have Morgwyn's Sacred Spear. This weapon is a spear that was blessed with the power of the Formless Mother. Morgwyn's Sacred Spear is among the longest great spears of the base game Elden Ring, and is also one of the most deadly bleed and arcane weapons as well. It does split fire and physical damage, with physical damage scaling from strength and dex, while fire damage is buffed by arcane. However, arcane also buffs its bleed buildup, which on paper looks very normal. However, do not be fooled by this, as this weapon's bleed does not come from its normal attacks, but it instead comes from its Ash of War, which is called Bloodboon Ritual. I don't think I need to describe what attack of Morg this Ash of War is replicating. Bloodboon Ritual boasts one of the highest bleed and fire damage of any attack in Elden Ring. As if that's not great enough, using this skill also coats this weapon with Bloodflame Blade for 15 seconds, which noticeably increases the fire damage and bleed buildup of this weapon. When you combine this weapon with all the bleed and fire related damage buffs, Morgwyn's Sacred Spear is capable of achieving some of the highest damage numbers you will ever see in Elden Ring and easily achieve more damage than any other boss weapon of this game. Now before we move ahead, some of you might be asking if you have watched my previous ranking lists, why is the Morgwyn's Sacred Spear so high on the list if it's acquired super late in the game? After all, I have ranked all such weapons very low on my list traditionally. Well, that's because it is actually possible to get this weapon before you even reach Altus Plateau. To get to Morgwyn Palace that early on, you need to do Varys questline, which only requires you to go to Rose Church in Liurnia. Now you might be asking, if that is the case, then why is this weapon on number 2 and not number 1? Well, that's because for me, damage alone does not make a weapon superior to a different weapon. While Blood Boon Ritual is very powerful, getting all 3 casts to hit something is quite unrealistic. The best way to do so is by using this skill when an enemy or boss is about to get staggered, but this is very unreliable. Also, while you can get to Morg very early, defeating him might be a major challenge, as this early in the game, you will get one shot by most of his attacks. However, if you manage to complete Elden Ring's version of Early Dancer, you can get the most powerful boss weapon of this game before even going in the first Legacy dungeon. As a result of this, Morgwyn's Sacred Spear easily takes the number 2 spot on this list. Before I reveal the definitely a surprise number 1 pick, here are a few honorable mentions. First is Grafted Dragon. This is a fist weapon that the players can never dual hand, however, its Ash of War does do very good damage against large enemies that are weak to fire. Second is Malekith's Black Blade. This is actually my favorite weapon in Elden Ring, however, as cool as Destined Death is, the late game acquisition of this weapon just did not make it a feasible option for me. Third is Hand of Malenia. This is the second longest katana of the game and only weapon that the players can use to perform the most terrifying attack in Soulsborne history, Waterfowl Dance. However, it also has the highest dex requirement of any weapon in the game at 48. Fourth is Dragon King's Crackblade. Once one of the coolest weapons of this entire game, this weapon was very unjustly nerfed by Shadow of the Erdtree, which completely butchered its amazing Ash of War called Thundercloud form. Rest in peace. And finally, Marika's Hammer. It's a pretty strong weapon despite its split holy damage thanks to its Ash of War called Goldbreaker. This Ash of War does an incredible amount of stance damage, however, since this weapon is acquired literally from the last boss of Elden Ring, it could not make it on to this list. With these honorable mentions out of the way, let's look at the best Remembrance weapon in Elden Ring. Taking the number 1 spot, we have the Blasphemous Blade. I'm pretty sure this pick was obvious to every player of Elden Ring, however for the uninitiated, Blasphemous Blade is the boss weapon you get from Reichardt's Remembrance, and is the 3rd longest greatsword in base Elden Ring. This weapon scales strongly from Faith and heals the player up to 4% of their maximum HP, as well as an additional 40 HP on top of it every time an enemy dies near the player. However, the thing that makes this weapon broken is its signature Ash of War, Taker's Flame. And this skill is broken. This attack resembles the shockwave attack that the Drake Sword had in Dark Souls 1, except there is no downside of high damage to weapon durability, as this mechanic is absent in Elden Ring. This Ash of War does insane damage and has incredible range, meaning you can safely get this attack off on any target. However, the best part about this is the fact that upon hitting anyone, you heal for 10% of your max HP, as well as get a ridiculous 150 HP back on top of it. Before Shadow of the Erdtree, Taker's Flame could launch humanoid enemies and bosses in the air, however this property was removed with patch 1.12. However, then Shadow of the Erdtree introduced a Talisman of the Dread which boosts magma based attacks damage by 15%. Guess which attack of Blasphemous Blade counts as magma attack? While this weapon's damage does not match the insanity that Morgwyn's Sacred Spear is capable of, this weapon is far more reliable in its damage, not to mention there is practically no skill required to pilot or even acquire this weapon, as you get a customized magical spear to slay the god-devouring blasphemous demigod. As a result, there is no better Remembrance weapon in Elden Ring than the Blasphemous Blade. And with that, another list comes to an end. Before I wrap up this video, I would like to answer why I did not include any DLC Remembrance weapons on this list. Well, the reason is their late game acquisition, which is a very important factor to me. This makes it impossible for them to compete with the base game Remembrance weapons, in my opinion, as by the time you get them, you have already passed through the challenge where they would have been the most useful. However, while they may not be able to compete with base game Remembrance weapons, they can certainly compete amongst each other, which is why I plan to make a DLC Remembrance weapons video in the future. So if you are interested in seeing that as well as other stuff from me, then consider subscribing to the channel as it costs you nothing. If you liked what you saw, then please leave a like on this video and share it with your fellow Tarnished. But other than that, have a wonderful day and don't you dare go hollow.